This is an essay in the series After the Walls Come Down, Building New Institutions from the Remains of a Broken World by William Young.
After the 9/11 attacks in 2001, the word terrorism became much more prominent in American vocabularies. Many aspects of American life were scrutinized for vulnerability to terror attacks. The federal government began a war on terror. Anyone who boards an airplane, visits a museum, or enters a federal government building now is a suspected terrorist, and nobody can be trusted. If the purpose of the 9/11 attacks was to instill terror in the American population, the 19 participants were enormously successful, albeit posthumously. Terrorism and terrorist are political words used by certain groups of people to describe certain types of violence committed by certain other groups of people. Terrorist violence implies involvement by political or religious groups. Foreign governments sometimes are accused of terrorist acts, but one's own government is considered incapable of doing such terrible things. In fact, all violence against unwilling victims terrorizes. It does not matter if the violence is committed in households against children, spouses, or others, or is committed on the street or in schools, or is committed by political groups who fly planes into buildings, or individuals who drive vehicles into crowds, or is committed by angry people who bring weapons into schools or places of worship, or is committed by government, police, or military forces, either domestically or in foreign countries. It is all violence and it all terrorizes. If you don't believe me, ask the victims, if they're still alive. People who use the word terrorist divide violence into different categories. A member of a political or religious group who plants a bomb that kills a dozen civilians is a terrorist. A military pilot who drops a bomb that kills a dozen civilians is not. The same is true for military forces who use drones to drop bombs or who plant landmines that blow up people who step on them. The deceased in all these instances are just as dead, the next of kin grieve just as much, and any survivors are just as traumatized. The term war crimes also creates categories of violence and suggests distinctions between wartime violence that is acceptable and wartime violence that is not. Violent political figures in large, powerful countries never are apprehended for war crimes, no matter how many victims they torture or kill, unless they are on the losing side of a war. People who have been raped, beaten up, or attacked by soldiers or police typically suffer severe emotional trauma. The terror and psychological scars can remain with them for the rest of their lives, and they will not appreciate the distinctions about whether the perpetrators were members of a political or religious group the government does not like, or whether the actions fit within the legal definition of a war crime. Violence does not need to be physical. Bullies who threaten to hurt or kill people are committing violence, and the victims typically are terrorized. Getting the threat out of one's thoughts can be difficult or impossible. Under the law, those who threaten to physically harm others are committing assault. If they do physical harm, they are committing assault and battery. Violence committed against them is not considered as bad as violence against us. Who is regarded as us and them varies considerably. Some regard those living in their country or community to be us. Some regard people in their ethnic or religious group to be us. In America, some consider only white people or only African Americans or only Hispanics to be us. Some men consider only men to be us, and some women consider only women to be us. Some consider only those with the same sexual orientation to be us. Some, including those who actually follow the teachings of Christ, a small group, regard every human in the world as us. Some consider us to be two or more groups. Taken further, Jainists, Buddhists, and Hindus who believe in ahimsa regard all living creatures to be us. Ahimsa is a Sanskrit word meaning nonviolence. Some people regard everything in the natural environment to be us and believe that violence committed against the environment should be a crime. Some vegetarians believe anything with a face to be us and should not be killed or eaten. Animals are considered to be less than human and okay to kill. It is a short step for people to regard humans in a different group to be like animals and okay to kill. The French philosopher Simone Weil wrote an essay called The Iliad, or the Poem of Force, in which she defines force as that which turns anything subjected to it into a thing. She said, quote, "Exercised to the limit, it turns man into a thing in the most literal sense. It makes a corpse out of him. Somebody was there, and the next minute there is nobody here at all," unquote. Many examples from history show that people regarded as them are thought of as less than human things. In chattel slavery, slaves are legally considered to be the property of their owners. In 1781, the crew of the British slave ship Zong threw 132 slaves overboard when the ship ran low on drinking water. The owners of the ship tried to claim insurance compensation for their lost cargo. The courts ruled initially in favor of the ship's owners. The verdict was subsequently overturned, but the crew of the Zong was never tried for murder. Chattel slavery in the U.S. was a government-sanctioned system based on violence, kidnapping, and murder. The white supremacists in the MAGA regime, who continue to regard black people as less than human things, are still upset about the result of the American Civil War and that slavery is no longer legal. They are trying to erase any mention of the Civil War and slavery from history, and they are vehemently opposed to the 1619 Project, which documents murder and other violent crimes committed by slaveholders. The word violence comes from the Latin violentus, which means vehement or forcible. It is properly related to violare, which means to treat with violence. Rape is sometimes referred to as violation. It should be prosecuted as a violent crime rather than a sex crime. The reported incidence of sexual violence represents only a tiny percentage of the sexual violence that occurs. For every high-profile case, such as the one involving Harvey Weinstein, countless other cases are unreported. Capital punishment is state-sponsored killing. The definition of a capital crime varies by country, and despotic regimes sometimes broadly define crimes to be capital offenses in order to eliminate opposition. Most civilized countries have abolished the death penalty, but a number of major countries still use it. China does not release capital punishment figures, but it is believed to be the country that executes the greatest number of people. Currently, the U.S. has a couple thousand prisoners on death row. More than a third of the states in the U.S. still execute people, with most of these states being in the southeastern quadrant of the country. This quadrant is where the MAGA regime has its strongest support and where the greatest number of lynchings occurred after the Civil War. A major problem with capital punishment, other than its barbarity, is its finality. If people are wrongly convicted, the mistake or injustice cannot be corrected after a person is executed. The number of people wrongly convicted of capital crimes in the U.S. is thought to be around 4%. Those who support capital punishment say it is a deterrent. No convincing evidence supports this. States with the death penalty tend to have high murder rates. Proving deterrence is not possible because you cannot prove that people who did not commit crimes were deterred. But it is highly doubtful that most people who are about to commit murder suddenly stop and think, I better not do this because our state has the death penalty. The concept of murder becomes murkier when the killing is not direct. Countries that bomb critical infrastructure so that people no longer have access to safe drinking water or other necessities are committing mass murder. Murder can be committed by governments whose policies fail to stop preventable deaths, such as from starvation or the inability to receive medical care for treatable conditions. In 1996, Bill Clinton's Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was asked on 60 Minutes whether she thought the sanctions on Iraq were worth the estimated 500,000 deaths of children who died as a result. Albright said that it was a hard choice, but she thought the price was worth it. Some people have questioned whether the estimate of deaths was correct, but if the actual number were only 100,000 dead Iraqi children, that still would have been mass murder. When the MAGA regime cut USAID funds in 2025, the British medical journal The Lancet estimated that the funding cuts could cause an additional 14 million deaths by 2030, or about 2.4 million deaths per year. These include the deaths of 4 to 5 million children, or about 700,000 a year. Once again, if the MAGA cuts in aid cause half as many people to die slow, miserable deaths, it is still a gruesome form of mass murder. Genocide is the systematic killing of people because of their race, religion, or membership in a particular group. Democide is the widespread killing by a government of its own people or people in another country, regardless of their membership in any group. The estimates of people killed through genocide and democide are so large that they are impossible to comprehend. The millions of Jews killed by Hitler was genocide, but this number is probably less than a third of the people he killed through democide. The number of Hitler's killings was probably less than the number killed in Stalin's USSR or Mao's China. This does not mean that Hitler was not as bad as Mao and Stalin. All of these people were responsible for tens of millions of deaths. A quote attributed to Stalin is that a single death is a tragedy, but 1 million deaths is a statistic. Lewis Mumford wrote that even though the United States and Soviet Union fought to stop Hitler during World War II, both countries adopted genocide as their official defense policy after the war. The so-called mutual assured destruction, if either nation launched a nuclear attack, was little more than a pledge to commit genocide with more effective methods than those employed by Hitler. Most people in the world go about their daily business without thinking about the dangers genocidal weapons can cause. But as the number of nations with nuclear weapons has grown, the threat is greater that one of them could launch a weapon of mass destruction and make parts of the world uninhabitable. Some countries with nuclear weapons engage in proxy wars, choosing a side in a conflict different from another nuclear power without fighting with them directly. Such proxy wars likewise increase the risk of nuclear war. More than 80 years have passed since the United States dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. Since then, 8 other countries are now thought to possess nuclear weapons. The weapons are considered a deterrent against possible attacks from other nations. Rather than making the world safer, the current situation is an incentive for countries without nuclear weapons to obtain them, so other countries will be reluctant to attack. If multiple countries in volatile areas such as the Middle East have access to nuclear weapons, the chances of a nuclear war will increase. The solution is not to bomb the countries trying to develop nuclear weapons, but to remove the weapons from the countries which now have them. Some countries possessing nuclear weapons do not have stable or trustworthy governments. North Korea is an indigent country with an unstable leader. Russia has a cold-blooded leader who does not hesitate to use extreme violence to achieve his goals. The United States is led by an impetuous MAGA mobster whose unhinged behavior could go in any direction. And Israel has shown no qualms about committing genocide in Gaza. using armaments partly paid for by U.S. taxpayers. After World War II, the world was shocked by images of Nazi death camps. The State of Israel was created as a haven for Jewish people, and Holocaust memorials and museums were erected in many cities throughout the world to support the idea that genocide should never happen again. The current far-right leadership in Israel has amended the script to say that genocide should never happen again to us, but it is okay if Israel does it to other people. Just as abused children grow up to be abusers, the State of Israel has been living out its retribution fantasy. The images of the destruction in Gaza remind me of a phrase the Roman historian Tacitus quoted from a Caledonian chieftain talking about the Roman military. Ubi solitudinem faciunt pacem appellant, which means they make a desert and call it peace. One wonders if the Gaza people in current and future generations will ever feel anything but violent hatred for Israelis and all Jewish people. Money spent on armaments and military personnel cannot be spent to improve the lives of people. These opportunity costs were a concern of President Dwight Eisenhower, who had seen the horrors of war as the commander of American forces during World War II. The United States expanded its nuclear arsenal during his presidency, but Eisenhower expressed serious reservations about the military-industrial complex which had developed. In 1953, shortly after he became president, Eisenhower gave a speech entitled "The Chance for Peace." He said, quote, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It is 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000 population. It is 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals. It is some 50 miles of concrete highway. We pay for a single fighter plane with 500,000 bushels of wheat. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people," unquote. 50 years later, the World Watch Institute released the publication Vital Signs 2003, shortly before the second American invasion of Iraq. In it, Michael Renner wrote, quote, "The renewed growth in world military expenditures has troubling implications for many of the world's unmet needs in the fields of health, education, general human well-being, and environmental protection. Estimates suggest, for instance, that the prevention of soil erosion worldwide would require something on the order of $24 billion annually. The elimination of starvation and malnutrition, $19 billion. Reproductive health for all women, $12 billion. Safe, clean drinking water, $10 billion. Prevention of acid rain, $8 billion. And elimination of illiteracy, $5 billion. Although these are substantial sums, they pale in comparison with the funds being made available for military expenditures." End of quote. These numbers add up to $78 billion, the exact amount President George W. Bush initially requested from Congress for the second invasion of Iraq. Congress approved the appropriation with little debate. Had someone asked the U.S. to spend $78 billion on Renner's list, they would have been called irresponsible and told that America could never find so much money to pay for these things. Suppose in 2003 the United States had said it was going to spend $78 billion to invade Iraq, to build houses, provide health care, create jobs, feed the hungry, and do other things to help the Iraqi people. The U.S. would have gained the lasting gratitude of Iraqis and would have been hailed as heroes rather than hated as invaders. Many other countries would have tried to provoke a similar invasion. The $78 billion was only a small part of the total amount America has spent on the Iraq War. Economists Joseph Stiglitz and Linda Bilmes estimated that if you include long-term care for wounded veterans, survivor benefits for families of soldiers killed, and other secondary costs, the total amount would be closer to $3 trillion. People who claim the U.S. lacks the money to fund sustainable, life-affirming programs have no problem spending unconscionable amounts for anti-life activities to protect fossil fuel supplies. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the United States spending on defense in 2024, roughly $1 trillion, was higher than the defense budgets of the next 9 highest countries combined, and more than a third of the estimated $2.7 trillion spent by all of the world's countries on their militaries. Massive arms spending might encourage war because spending money on military equipment might be difficult to justify if the equipment is not used. Excess military equipment is now being provided to American police forces, with police officers increasingly resembling soldiers going to war. The MAGA president is using soldiers and military equipment to launch a war against the American people in parts of the country that did not support him during his elections. United States political attitudes are now so belligerent and perverse that many Americans applaud increases in military spending while vehemently opposing plans to offer free or affordable health care, which most civilized, developed countries provide. Countries spend money to prepare for war rather than to promote peace, even though the failure to address environmental problems, poverty, and inequality poses a much greater threat to their national security than invasion by a foreign country. War is a form of extreme violence that tests those who believe in peace. People who speak out against war are often asked how they would have responded to Hitler. Because peace-loving people sometimes need to fight off an attack on themselves, their families, their neighbors, or their country, does not mean they support war and violence, or that it is okay when other people do. There is a huge difference between offensive violence and defensive actions in the face of violence. The fact that the MAGA regime has rebranded the U.S. Department of Defense as the Department of War shows which side of the offensive-defensive violence issue they are on. The issue of violence needs to be addressed quickly because humans now have access to increasingly powerful means of killing. People have been fighting for most of recorded history. The damage was limited when they fought only with spears and stones. Over time, horses, knives, guns, and bombs have been used to more effectively kill. Not long after the Wright brothers' initial airplane flight, the opposing sides in World War I used airplanes to drop bombs. World War I also saw the first use of gas warfare. World War II featured more sophisticated planes and weaponry, including the first use of atomic bombs. The U.S. space program grew out of efforts to develop long-range missiles for bombing other countries. To reduce the incidence of violence, one first must determine its root causes, which is not easy. American history, as well as the rest of human history, is drenched in blood and violence. Many factors contribute to violent behavior, and the factors have changed over time, as have the types of violence, both for individuals and society as a whole. Jean-Jacques Rousseau believed that people are not born violent, but learn violence by living in societies. Lewis Mumford said that war is a cultural institution, suggesting that it arises when people join together with others. War might have started when various groups needed sacrifices for religious ceremonies. Some groups might have captured their human sacrifices with similar methods they used to hunt animals. The groups being hunted might have developed defenses, causing the process to escalate into war. Most people have the capacity to think violent thoughts, but those who have developed moral restraints usually do not perform violent acts. Some who are normally peaceful can become violent if pushed beyond a breaking point. The impetus for passing the breaking point could come from an emotional situation, mental illness, alcohol, or other drugs. It could be fueled by anger about politics or government. One can make an analogy between cancer cells and violence. Cancer cells might be present in a great many people and kept in check by a healthy immune system. But if something compromises or overwhelms the immune system, cancer can develop. Similarly, if something overwhelms a person's moral restraints, violence can develop. Despite their long record of violent behavior as a species, humans do not appear to be inherently violent. Genetics might have something to do with violent behavior, but it is not the most important cause. Some people and cultures show no predilection for violence. Men are much more likely to be violent than women, which suggests that having a Y chromosome might have something to do with being violent, but not all men are violent. The great apes are similar genetically to humans, and their use of violence varies by species. Chimpanzees, who are the closest to humans genetically, can be very violent, but they're not violent all the time. Bonobos, who are closely related to chimpanzees, have a matriarchal social structure that is less violent, and they often settle conflicts with sexual acts. Gorillas are more peaceful than chimpanzees and are mostly vegetarian, contrary to the violent images portrayed in the movie King Kong. Orangutans are mostly peaceful and solitary. A lot of violence exists in the animal kingdom, and even sometimes in the plant kingdom with carnivorous plants. Predators in food chains kill prey to eat it. Some animals kill or harm others when competing for food, territory, dominance, or mates. Some male animals pair up with females and kill any young sired by a different male. Yet humans are the only creatures who sometimes practice violence simply for the thrill of doing it. Animals have good reasons to avoid needless or unwinnable conflicts. Falcons attacking prey want to kill it with as little resistance as possible. Having a difficult struggle with another animal could result in injury, which could lead to death by starvation. Injured animals cannot go to a hospital for a couple weeks to recuperate. For territorial struggles, an animal who feels beaten might make a surrender gesture, such as exposing their throat, to signal to the opponent to stop the attack. The environment in which humans grow up and live can be an important cause of violent behavior. It is not the sole determinant, but it is probably more important than genetics. Whether children have positive male and female role models in their home can have an effect, as can if they were physically abused or if their parents fought a lot. Poverty can have an effect, as well as the culture in which people live. Still, people who grow up under the same conditions can differ greatly in how violent they become. People who have been traumatized are more likely to commit violence. Children who are the victims of violence often grow up to be violent adults. Various writers have suggested that the dream of the slave is not to eliminate slavery, but to be master. When young people are beaten up by someone larger, they might dream about when they will be the master administering the beating. When large numbers of people live in close proximity, the incidence of violence can increase. If a town with a population of 1,000 has 1/10 of 1% of its residents who are extremely violent, that amounts to only one person and usually can be controlled. If a city of 1 million has 1/10 of 1% of its residents who are extremely violent, that amounts to 1,000 people, and the other 99.9% might be afraid to walk the streets. Large numbers of people who are upset about similar issues can form gangs or mobs and do things most individuals would not do by themselves. People committing violent acts as part of a group reinforce one another. The U.S. founding fathers were deeply concerned about mobs and what could trigger violent insurrections. Guns play an important role in the amount and types of violence that occur. Countries with fewer guns have fewer homicides. The United States now has more guns than people, and the proliferation of guns has had a huge effect on the types and severity of violence occurring. Much of the extreme violence is caused by the use of extreme weapons, and many homicides would not occur were guns not involved. The firearms available now are more lethal than in the past. The proliferation of semi-automatic weapons means that mass shootings are now much more common. One definition of a mass shooting is if 4 or more people are killed or wounded. Since 2019, more than 400 mass shootings have occurred in the U.S. each year, which averages to between 1 and 2 a day. In June 2022, a friend sent me an article about a mass shooting in Philadelphia in which 3 people were killed and 11 wounded. A few weeks later, I visited a website listing mass shootings in the United States. The site showed 25 mass shootings per page, and the Philadelphia shooting was already near the bottom of page 2. In each year from 2022 to 2024, more than 300 school shootings occurred. Children were shot, as were teachers and other school staff. Students or former students who hold a grudge against the school or are involved in a dispute with students at the school now are more likely to use lethal means to settle it. Some of the murdered or wounded students were in elementary school. The thoughts and prayers for the victims offered by the gun proponents are doing nothing to stop the slaughter of these children. Some gun proponents even deny that the slaughter is happening. From 2022 to 2024, the average number of school shootings was just below 2 a day. From 1966 to 2018, no year had more than 60 school shootings, and most years had far fewer. The fact that a school shooting every week or two now seems like a low number is an indication of the extent to which violence is accepted as normal in the U.S. The Second Amendment to the Constitution, which is so often quoted in truncated form by people opposed to domestic disarmament, says, quote, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." End of quote. None of the school shooters have been part of a well-regulated militia, and what they did had nothing to do with maintaining the security of a free state. Many people own guns in case an intruder enters their home. The same guns needed to confront intruders also are available when a couple has a fight or when a child finds a loaded gun in a dresser drawer. Other people own guns because they want to be prepared for an armed revolution. The attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, was a dress rehearsal for a confrontation that a disturbing number of Americans want to occur. History has shown that violent revolutions can topple a government, with the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the 2025 revolution in Nepal being examples. However, it is much easier to oust or kill a leader and the leader's supporters than to install a new leader and government to effectively address the problem that led to the unrest. Too often, political revolutions lead to systems that are just as bad or worse than the ones replaced. A song called Perfection by the band Badfinger has the lyric, quote, "There's no good revolution, just power changing hands," end of quote. Another lyric in the song is, quote, "There's no good kind of killing, just power taking life," end of quote. More than half the gun deaths in the United States are suicides. People can commit suicide by other means, but few are as effective as using a gun. The National Institute of Mental Health estimates that 21 million Americans have had at least one depressive episode. If a person having such an episode does not have access to effective treatment but has access to a gun, the results can be tragic. They commit acts of violence against themselves. Those who hate themselves sometimes use a gun to shoot other people before taking their own life. People exposed to a steady diet of violence on screens might become desensitized to real violence. Media companies seeking to increase their viewership try to outdo one another in the levels of violence they show. Movies and television programs show bloody corpses as well as graphic violence and torture. Some video games show graphic representations of people killing others, with killing and blowing things up being the object of the games. People who are exposed to all this violence might regard images of the bombing and genocide in Gaza as simply more death and destruction on a screen. On commercial television in the U.S., a stronger taboo exists against swearing and unclothed bodies than for shootings and other violent scenes. People now have access to a greater number of outlets to incite violence. Hate groups who used to be able to influence only people in their immediate area now can send messages all over the country and the world. Just as people on social media often write things they would not say if they were with a person, people can send hateful, violent messages without worrying about consequences. Increasingly, politicians are subjected to violent threats, and in some cases, violence or assassination. Many decent and caring people no longer want to serve. A lot of those who now serve are ego-driven types who are more interested in dismantling government services than providing them. As the quality of government services has declined, the public has become more dissatisfied with government, which has led to more anger and hate directed at elected and appointed officials. The treatment of people who commit crimes can contribute to violent behavior. Politicians try to outdo one another to show voters how tough they are on crime and criminals. They shovel huge amounts of money into America's prison industrial complex, which is based on punishment rather than on rehabilitation programs to turn violent offenders into participating members in society. The way people are treated in prison and when released contributes to America's high recidivism rate and the level of crime in communities, which leads politicians to call for more arrests and harsher sentences. Throughout history, religion has both taught peace and incited violence. With monotheistic religions, people who believe their God is the only God often fight to defend their beliefs and discriminate against those with different beliefs. Violence can occur between different religions, such as between Hindus and Muslims, or Jews and Muslims, or it can occur between sects of the same religion, such as Irish Protestants and Irish Catholics in Christianity, or Sunnis and Shias in Islam. Many people who purport to belong to a religion do not observe the religion's tenets. For instance, one cannot be both a Christian and a MAGA supporter because the two doctrines are diametrically opposed. MAGA doctrine is based on violent values rather than on the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Sports contribute to the normalization of violence. Some sports, such as American football, feature violent collisions on virtually every play. Ice hockey features many violent collisions and occasional fistfights. The object of boxing and ultimate fighting, or UFC, is to knock one's opponent unconscious. In all these sports, the more violent the collisions or punches, the louder the crowds cheer. The language of sports includes many violent metaphors. A long pass thrown by a quarterback is called a bomb, as is a long home run hit in baseball. A blitz in football occurs when linebackers or defensive backs rush the opposing passer. In sports playoffs, a series or game where the loser is eliminated is called a knockout round. Some overtime games feature sudden death, in which the winner is the first team to score. A player or team with a lot of ways of succeeding is said to have many weapons. Exhibitions such as professional wrestling use extreme ritualized violence to whip spectators into a frenzy. Over the years, the fake kicks, punches, and match-ending maneuvers have become increasingly violent. Children are injured or cause injuries when imitating the violent stunts of professional wrestlers. It is telling that the pro-violence MAGA president has been a strong supporter of professional wrestling and has been elected to the World Wrestling Enterprises Hall of Fame. In the theater world, all drama is based on conflict. Athletic contests are popular because they feature athletes in conflict. Athletic contests reinforce the idea that there must always be winners and losers, and that one person or team is better than others. Some sports enthusiasts endlessly argue about who is the GOAT in a particular sport, the greatest of all time. In all sports, there are many more losers than winners, and the message is constantly drummed home that some people are clearly superior to others. Many people who watch sports want to be thought of as winners and try to do this vicariously through sports teams. If a local team or another team they support wins, they often say, "We won," rather than "the team won." One reason the narcissistic MAGA president egged on the January 6th insurrectionists was that he could not deal with being labeled a loser. He thinks of himself as a winner and wants everyone to view him and his brand that way. A statement misattributed to the Duke of Wellington is that, quote, "the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton," unquote. Eton is a posh boys' boarding school that a lot of the British ruling class attended. The quote suggests that the discipline of playing sports is the same discipline needed in war. The playing fields in the U.S. are less class-oriented than those at Eton, but American athletes learn similar lessons. One must ask about the effects on democracy and society of having so many people who have internalized the discipline needed for confrontations in war, and if having so many people who have internalized war discipline makes more war likely. Since 1948, the BBC has broadcast a series of Reith lectures each year, featuring a scholar focusing on a particular issue. They are named after John Reith, the BBC's first Inspector General. In 2024, the lectures were delivered by the forensic psychotherapist Gwen Adshead, who works with violent offenders in prisons. In one of her 4 lectures about violence, she talked about how alcohol, when combined with sports, can be a factor in causing violence. People in many countries are rabid supporters of their national football team. Dr. Adshead said that during the European Football Championship in 2024, a charity called Women's Aid, which offers aid in England for victims of domestic violence, reported that men's violence toward their wives and partners rose 38% when England's team lost, but it also rose 26% when their team won. Dr. Adshead said, quote, "This data may just be a reminder that alcohol intoxication is one of the potent risk factors for violence, but it also raises a question about the absence of the capacity for joy in the lives of men who hurt women, such that not even their team's success makes them feel better." End of quote. Dr. Adshead also quoted the historian Christopher Browning's study of soldiers in Nazi Germany who were ordered to kill civilians. About a third of the soldiers relished their task, about a third obediently followed orders, and the other third resisted and sought to be transferred. Dr. Adshead said it has been suggested that the emotional impact on military morale of this type of killing was reported to the Nazi high command and was a factor in the development of technology for mass murder in death camps. The philosopher Hannah Arendt talked about the banality of evil when writing about the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. Arendt described how seemingly ordinary people were capable of horrific acts. Soldiers who may have been taught "thou shalt not kill" in the Ten Commandments are suddenly asked to kill without feeling or moral restraint. The encouragement of hate for the enemy and the removal of moral restraints are reasons rape has been so pervasive during wars throughout history. When soldiers eventually shed their combat gear, some cannot easily throw off their violent Mr. Hyde persona and once again be like the peaceful Dr. Jekyll in the Robert Louis Stevenson story. A particularly disturbing aspect of what is happening now in America is the pleasure the MAGA regime and other far-right elements seem to experience by traumatizing people. It is consistent with Dr. Adshead's reference about how a third of German soldiers relished killing and brutalization. Police departments in the United States have been infiltrated by far-right and white supremacist elements, which was one reason for the police violence that led to the Black Lives Matter campaign before the MAGA regime reassumed power. Since the MAGA regime took over in 2025, masked ICE soldiers with weapons of war have been traumatizing people. ICE soldiers have been using extra-legal tactics to round up people from other countries who work in construction, restaurants, agriculture, the caring industries, and many other areas of employment. The Emma Lazarus poem, "The New Colossus," on the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty no longer applies. Instead of welcoming the huddled masses yearning to breathe free and lifting the lamp beside the golden door to welcome those from other lands, immigrants are being kicked out the golden door by ICE soldiers. Russell Vogt, the current head of the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, bragged that he wants to put federal bureaucrats, quote, "in trauma," unquote. He added that when bureaucrats wake up, he wants them to not want to go to work because they are increasingly viewed as villains. His goal is to make federal workers into ex-federal workers. People with careers in federal government service are seeing their jobs swept away along with their income, health insurance, and retirement plan. Many need to sell their homes because they can no longer afford to make mortgage payments. Even those who have not lost their jobs live in fear that they soon will. When a society is involved in war and other violent activities, people use a greater number of violent metaphors. Institutions are under siege or under attack. Some programs are targeted for elimination. Various activities are weaponized or used to inflict harm on particular groups or individuals, such as weaponizing the legal system to prosecute political enemies. Violent visual metaphors, such as politicians brandishing chainsaws to show they are serious about cutting government programs, invoke images from the movie The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. While violent metaphors abound, actual violence tends to be described with euphemisms. Military operations that kill civilians or blow up hospitals or schools are said to cause collateral damage. A euphemism for genocide is ethnic cleansing, which implies that the murdered people were somehow dirty. Governments that murder people without the benefit of a trial are committing extrajudicial killings. When the U.S. invades a country, it now labels the invasion with a euphemistic title, such as Operation Enduring Freedom for the invasion of Afghanistan and Operation Iraqi Freedom for the second invasion of Iraq. Many world leaders now are stretching the meaning of words to attack or persecute groups who protest. In mid-2025, the Labour government in Britain declared members of the group Palestine Action to be terrorists. They used this declaration to arrest demonstrators, even though some of those arrested have been elderly people peacefully protesting genocide against Palestinians. Some leaders of the MAGA regime have labeled the millions who participated in the No Kings marches in the autumn of 2025 as terrorists who hate America and support the Antifa or anti-fascist movement. The MAGA regime believes the protesters should behave more like the good white Americans who love the United States and support the PROFA or pro-fascist regime. In 1996, the basketball player Dennis Rodman released an autobiographical book called Bad as I Want to Be, which reflects the attitude of current MAGA supporters. They act as racist, sexist, homophobic, and xenophobic as they want to be, and they do not want to be told what they cannot say by people they regard as woke. Generally, only racists, sexists, homophobes, or xenophobes complain about woke. Most of the anti-woke attitude is based on hate and a contempt for people who are different. Societies need to examine conditions that are eroding moral restraints and making individual and group violence, some of it extreme, more prevalent. People in countries throughout the world are embracing fascism, and fascist regimes try to keep control by instilling fear and terror. Resisting and telling people not to cower in fear behind the walls the fascists are erecting is easier said than done. In his 1933 inaugural address, Franklin Roosevelt said that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. If this is true, we should be quite afraid because many people in America and the rest of the world are living in fear about what is now happening. Violence eats away at the roots of civilized society. The greater the number of damaged and angry victims of violence in a society, the less likely the society will be sustainable. As with other indicators for sustainability, the trend in violence is going in the wrong direction. The fact that violence is increasingly becoming exalted in the United States and other countries is extremely dangerous. Violence and hate lead to more violence and hate. Once this feedback loop begins, it is difficult or impossible to stop.